Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Police. It's being sponsored by the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, or PTACC. And the title of today's webinar is Deflection and Pre-Arrest Diversion, Standing Up for the Children. My name is Iris Smith, and I have the honor of moderating today's panel discussion. And we have some really dynamic panelists who will share some great information with you. For those of you who are not familiar with PTACC, the mission of PTACC is to strategically enhance the quantity and quality of community behavioral health and social service options through engaging in deflection and pre-arrest diversion. The collaborative's purpose is to provide a national vision, a leadership and advocacy, as well as education to facilitate the practice of deflection. And today's conversation will really focus on those closest to the identified person being considered in deflection, and that's the children and families, all of whom have been hurt by addiction and have struggled with it, usually for quite some time. So we do have some goals for you as participants. We would like you at the end of this webinar to be able to define deflection and diversion for those of you who are not familiar with those terms, to be able to discuss why it's important, as well as the need for including support services for children of those involved. We'd like you to be able to describe the impact of arrests and incarceration on children and family systems, and describe the actions that can be taken at the individual and community level to protect and support the children and families of individuals involved, or those at risk of involvement in the criminal justice system. So following the presentation of our panelists, you as participants will have an opportunity for a real-time conversation with the panelists. In the interest of time, though, I would like you to hold your questions until after all the panelists have presented. If a burning question comes up for you during the presentations, feel free to type it into the chat box, and our panelists will address them during the group discussion. I'd like to begin today's webinar with a short video presentation, and then we'll go into our first panelist discussion.
Adults can make a huge difference in these children's lives. What the research tells us, the presence of a caring, nurturing adult is huge. Could be a teacher, a minister, a soccer coach, an extended family member like a grandparent. It could be a counselor. It could be the school secretary, but it could be law enforcement. They can make a significant difference in the lives of children and families. Here's an example about a caring, nurturing adult making a difference in a child and in a family's life. Sheriff deputy got a domestic disturbance call, arrives at the scene, and there's grandma and grandson. What had happened, according to the grandmother, is her daughter had come to her house looking for money. They started fighting, they were yelling and screaming, and at one point the daughter pushed her mom. That's when the call was made. But by the time the deputy got there, the mom was gone. But this sheriff's deputy had been trained. He was knowledgeable. He knew exactly what to do. He sat with the grandma. She had explained this long history of her daughter's addiction, in and out of recovery, in all different kind of terrible predicaments, financially, spiritually, legally. And he talked about how this is a family disease. Now, he took out a one-page resource list for Riverside County, alcohol and drug recovery services. From peer coaches to recovery coaches to 12-step meetings to treatment centers. He left that. So if Grandma's daughter came back, there it was for her. But then he handed Grandma a pamphlet for the Betty Ford Center Children's Program. He explained to Grandma that this is a family disease and everybody gets affected by it, everybody gets stressed out, and here would be a great opportunity to get help for her grandson and maybe even for herself. And so the Hazelden Betty Ford Children's Program is for 7 to 12-year-olds. And the first part of it is 4 days, full days. And there's a purpose behind that. If you really want to develop a relationship with boys and girls who come from families where they learn don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel, you need to spend the time to build relationship, to build trust, so often missing. So Grandma brings Lawrence, her 7-year-old grandson, the first morning. I will never forget this. He comes in, serious, oh my goodness, adult-like, but wary, looking around and wanting to figure out what was going on and uncertain of everything. Now, the first thing we do in the program is everybody makes a name tag. And so that's the first thing we do after a welcome. And so I see him over in a corner and he's got 5 name tags all crumpled up or ripped up. And think about it, he's 7 years old. Remember how big we wrote our letters when we were 7 years old? He could not get Lawrence on 1 name tag. And he was getting so incredibly frustrated. So I saw it, went and got 2 name tags. Put them right next to each other and said, hey, try 2 name tags. And he didn't say thank you, didn't acknowledge, but there he was. He's the only child in the history of our children's program that needed 2 name tags. So it was Lawrence, Lawrence, Lawrence. When he finished it, I went back to him. I got on my knees. I wanted to be at his eye level. I need to enter his world. And I said, your name is Lawrence. And I pointed to my name tag. I'm Jerry. And I asked him, do you suppose I could call you Larry while you're here these next 4 days? And he stopped. He put his marker down. He stopped. He looked at me. And his response was, perhaps. Incredibly serious. During that first day, he didn't have much to say, but he was engaged. He played. He listened. And all the other boys and girls made him feel part of this group. Second morning, Grandma brings him back in. First one to arrive. And Grandma sticks her head in the door, children's program group room, and says to me, can I see you for a minute? And I gotta tell you, even after all these years, when I have a parent or a grandparent say, can I see you for a minute? On the inside, it's like, oh no, what went wrong? I'm sorry, I won't do it again, please. So we left and went back to my office, and we sat for a minute. And she shook her head. His grandma that looked tired and looked to be full of pain and despair. She says, I'm not sure what you did yesterday. I asked Lawrence 3 times, and each time he said, Grandma, it's confidential. And she looked at me, and she actually took her hand and put it on my hand on the desk. And she said, when I woke up this morning, my grandson had a smile that I haven't seen for a really long time. Jerry, the biggest issue we have every morning is getting ready for school. It's a power struggle. We're always late. We both yell. We both say things we don't mean. Lawrence melts down. It's awful. I want you to know, this morning when I got up, Lawrence was fully dressed with his shoes on and tied, sitting at the door, front door, and said, Grandma, hurry up. I don't want to be late. 2 hours before the program was supposed to take place. Kids don't care about how much you know until they know about how much you care. During that second day, there's more trust. Lawrence listened to other boys and girls talk about addiction in their families. The yelling, the fighting, the broken promises, a parent going away and not coming back for multiple days. He heard all that. He could see at an even deeper level that he wasn't alone. And he kept hearing the words, addiction could never be a kid's fault. You didn't make this happen. You can't make it better. That's not a child's job. A child's job is simply to be a kid. Those are adult problems. At the end of the day, the last therapeutic activity, right toward the end, he raised his hand. And to all of his friends, all of his peers, and to the counselor said, my mom got trapped by addiction too. First time we've heard those words. On the third and the fourth day of our program, the parents or grandparents or caregivers participate. It's Mrs. Ford telling me a long time ago, if you want to make a difference in a child's life, just don't work with the child, work with who's ever raising that child. And so Grandma participated. In the adult part of the program, first thing in the morning, learned two important things as Grandma introduced herself. Number one, that her father had died from alcoholism when she was a teenager. And you see that multi-generational cycle. Come on, where does this stuff stop? But the other thing that she said was the tremendous amount of guilt and shame that she had that her daughter has this disease, and was really beating herself up. And I think at times bailing her daughter out, taking on her consequences. The big event on that third day is Lawrence and Grandma got to sit knee to knee in the middle of a big circle. Lawrence was last after all of his friends went first. And he had written 3 sentences about it, how addiction had hurt his family. Because everybody in the family gets hurt. Not just the person with the substance use disorder, but the other family members as well. He didn't want to read his story, which is, okay, what do you want to tell your grandma today? It took him about 10 seconds, a couple of deep breaths, and then he looked at her and said, Grandma, I'm scared. I am so scared. At which point he just started crying. He told her that when he goes to sleep at night, the last thing he thinks about before falling asleep is his mom. Where is she? Is my mom okay right now? Are bad people hurting her? Is she using drugs? Is she going to have to go to jail? Will I ever see my mom again? And then so much of that emotional pain just started coming out. You could see his body relax. And now he wasn't just trusting, he was talking and he was feeling. We did one more thing. When he had done that, and just let him and Grandma be, because she's all teary, she's all emotional. And I looked at Lawrence, and they're sitting knee to knee, and I'm on the floor between the two of them, making it safe and facilitating. And I said, Lawrence, I want you to remember that your mom, that's Grandma's little girl. Grandma gets scared too. It's okay to be scared. And then they hugged. On the last day of our 4-day program, which is the initial phase you'll see in just a moment, one of the activities that we have each family do is to make a plan, a family plan. How are we going to stay healthy? How are we going to take what we learned here and continue to practice? Because if you don't practice it and reinforce it, what you learn will go away in a relatively short period of time. As they made the family plan, and I didn't see it until they shared it, but big piece of paper, there was a section for Grandma. Here's the things Grandma's going to do. There's a section for Lawrence, who now I was allowed to call Larry. So there was a section for Larry. Here's the things they were going to do. In the middle, it intersected what they were going to do together. And you know what they did? They left the whole section. They just wrote the word mom. And maybe someday mom will come and join us and be a part of this. And that was the hope. When we did our continuing care meeting with Grandma, I had a couple recommendations. Number one, it'd be really good if she did the family program. And if she really did an extended family program where she could learn to let go of her daughter's disease while still caring about her daughter. Or as they say in Al-Anon, 12-step groups, detaching with love and setting boundaries. So Grandma does family program and embraces it. And is going to Al-Anon. And every Wednesday night, pre-pandemic, was kid night at the Betty Ford Center. So Larry's in group with kids going through the same thing he is, building those skills, remembering those messages. Grandma's in an Al-Anon meeting that focused on parenting and grandparenting. And they went on with their lives. 6 months later, Mom asks for help. There's no one bailing her out anymore. And the negative consequences of her disease are catching up with her. I will never forget Larry's enthusiasm and excitement and being over the moon. And even though I knew that Mom was in treatment, I had to pretend that I didn't. Because he came running into my office after his group on Wednesday night. Jerry, guess what? Mom's in treatment. My mom is doing TNR, which children's program is treatment and recovery. The arch nemesis of addiction, because when people hang with TNR, addiction can't mess with them anymore. And he was just so excited. And Mom had a lot of work to do. And everybody needs to realize is that recovery is a process. And Mom took 6 months, treatment, and a halfway house. And then she came back, and all of a sudden on Wednesday nights, there's Grandma, there's Mom, and there's Larry. And each week, you could just see a little bit more of the little boy in Larry. A couple months later, we determined it was the right time. And now Larry went through the children's program for a second time, but this time with his mom. What a great experience. When it was time to do the knee-to-knee exercise I made reference to before, again, he didn't want to read what he wrote, no worries. But he just looked at Mom and basically said, I'm so proud of you. Thank you for getting help. Thank you for getting better. And I asked him if he would tell Mom how he knew that Mom was getting better. And he looked at her and said, you play with me. You spend time with me. You don't fight with Grandma very much anymore. You stay home at night. And you keep your promises. And they just hugged because this mom, Larry's mom, recovery isn't easy. You got to work on it every single day. And she was scratching and clawing. And what an incredible validation for all of her hard work. Now it's amazing. I started working full-time in the treatment field, alcohol and drug treatment field, in the early 1980s. And I'll never forget, I was told, here I am, young and naive, and I was told, don't worry about the children and the families. The first thing we need to focus on is let's get help for the person with the substance use disorder, and then we can focus on the family. Think about how few people ever make it to treatment and ever make it to recovery. We can't forget about those children. We can't forget about those families. Those boys and girls like Larry first hurt and often the last helped. And so, what would have happened if that sheriff's deputy hadn't handed the program brochure to Grandma for the children's program? Now, what would have happened if he had seen, okay, Mom's not here, you're okay, all right, I'm on my way. But he knew exactly what to do. And if he hadn't done that, where would Grandma be today? Where would Mom be today? Where would that precious little boy be today?
Thank you, Jerry, for that wonderful, powerful story. That is a really moving video that illustrates the importance of working with an entire family. I would like to go on and welcome our next panelist, Sis Winger, who is the Executive Director of the National Association for Children of Alcoholics, someone who spent much of her life working and advocating for children of addicted parents. So Sis, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Iris told you who I work with. I work with the National Association for Children of Addiction. We have as our mission to eliminate the adverse consequences of alcohol and drug use on families and children. That's our mission. And how do we do that? We know the stories that Jerry has just told you. We know that that there are knowledgeable adults who were in that scenario. And what we believe at NACOA is that we must bring the knowledge and the pain and the solutions for children like Lawrence. We really must bring them to help that they need, but they can't get it unless the adults who are interacting with them every day know what's wrong with them. When you think about the children that are in the juvenile justice system, if you really do a study of where they come from, the first thing in their lives was that they were children of addicted parents. And so they are much more likely to be in the justice system. They're much more likely to have trouble learning in school. They're much more likely to be like Lawrence was with his grandmother, fighting instead of being dressed and ready to go. We believe very strongly that awareness can build empathy in decision makers. And because of that, we believe that if they become empathetic, they will be strengthened in the ability to understand, and they will try and apply it to decision making. So for example, teachers who are really angry with an acting out child or with a child who's quietly sitting in the corner and won't answer, those teachers, if they don't know that that children like that need to be welcomed into help, like Jerry has just described to you, and how do they get welcomed? Well, a teacher needs to understand that 1 out of 4 children in their classroom is secretly hiding the profound dysfunction and fear and confusion at home that comes from living with addiction. Many of these children hide their reality very well. They are great actors, and that's the way they survive. At a time like we've been in this past year, the terror and the horrors that have surfaced in these families, which have been trapped at home, the children cannot get out, everybody's quarantined. And so what did they lose? They lost the stability that they get when they go to school. They know at least one adult when they go to school who cares about them. They know that they can trust the people in the school. There's a sense of predictability, all of which can help them to remain stable. But if they can't go to school day after day and week and month after month, they have lived in families where parents are drinking and using more drugs, where the behavior is more bizarre, where the fear is greater, and there's no one that they know to touch who will be a safe person that they can get help from. So these have been very difficult times, particularly now for these children, many of whom, Jerry mentioned it, come generationally through addiction. It passes through one generation to the next. And so does the trauma that addiction engenders in the family. So you have two things traveling through generations, and children like Lawrence are trying to sort it out. And if we don't have adults who are doing what that officer did, dropping information, if we don't have people asking, what's it like at home when they're trying to deal with the adult that is potentially being deflected. We believe that this education and empathy really and truly does change the behavior of school superintendents, of pediatricians, of teachers, counselors, social workers, and even of the next door neighbor. If the next door neighbor knows that addiction is a disease that dramatically impacts the brain of the person who has it and also impacts the brain of the developing child exposed to it on a regular basis. And if they know that, and they know the child, they can reach out and invite them in for cookies, can invite them to come and play with their children. But instead, what happens in reality is opportunities to have normal child interactions really are not available to them because most adults try to move away from families where there's dysfunction because it makes them uncomfortable. So we really believe that if we could help the decision makers who work with children every day to understand about addiction. So take the clergy, for example. We've done an enormous amount of training for clergy. Over 40 states have had all-day workshops for clergy. And what are we teaching them? The nature of addiction in the parameters of a family. What happens to a family? Help them to understand how to respond to people who come to them for help. Help them to do educational programs that are appropriate to faith communities. And so I'm hoping that at the end of the day today, all of you will come away wondering who it is that you could give some information to. If you have children in a school, would you go to the school principal or to the school counselor and ask what kind of services they have? After all, it's 25% of the students in their school, and they probably have no clue who most of them are. And so what do we do when people don't know? We don't want to tell them to go find and identify and label and record. You want to let them know that there are people in the school who understand what they're going through. How do you do that? Well, you train the teachers so that they can weave comments into various educational sessions and then bring up addiction and then bring up the fact that lots of kids live in families where a mom or dad who drinks too much or uses drugs, and it's really scary. But there's somebody in our school, Mrs. Smith down the hall, and not Dr. Smith, Mrs. Smith down the hall knows a lot about it. So if you're ever worried about somebody in your family who's using drugs or drinking too much, you can always go to her and ask her for help. Giving that kind of messages to entire classes just casually, just like teachers say things casually on lots of subjects, and giving the children the first of all, the information that they're not alone, that there are lots of kids like him. Some of them are right there in his class, that there are grownups who know something about it, and those grownups might care, and that those grownups are down the hall. And in every system that impacts our children, the social welfare system and the faith communities and the educational system, we really need to look at our language and look at our assumptions. But if we are doing anything with an adult who has addiction, we don't tell them that there is someplace they can go. We don't try to encourage treatment programs to add educational support groups. It's interesting, a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Nora Volkoff did a webinar in which she was asked about recovery. She made a number of really cogent comments, but the one thing that struck me was when she said, recovery happens in relationships. It cannot happen in isolation. And so if recovery happens in relationships, recovery for the children does too. We see children who are troubled. They do not need to be rushed off most of the time to a mental health clinician to be seen once in a while. They can be sitting in a group, an educational group. We call them educational support groups, where they are learning what Jerry was talking about. They're learning about TNR. They're learning about the control that a brain disease has on their parents. They're learning that they are not alone. They are learning absolutely that it never was their fault and that there is not a thing that they can do that would make a difference for them, that would make a difference for the parents' behavior. What we try to do is to help children and all adults, caring adults, can do these things. They do not need to have training and counseling, but all of us need to help children to understand what we call the 7 C's, something that actually Jerry helped to develop. And the 7 C's start off with the rules. I didn't cause it. Much of what Jerry was doing on the first day, I am sure, of his program for Lawrence, he was teaching these 7 C's. So if children believe, they believe because they've been yelled at and told that it was their fault, and now you did it again, kind of comments at home, they really do believe that they caused their parents to use. And they believe that they need to do something about it. So they keep trying to do things. They try to pour the booze down the sink. They try to hide the pills. They try to make the bed better, to do something for mom. They're just trying to control their parents. If it's their fault, maybe they can be nicer and then it won't be their fault, is how they think. But they also then need to finally learn they cannot fix it, and that their job, and this is part of what Jerry said about their role is to be a kid. They need to learn how to take care of themselves. It isn't that they can do it on their own. They need safe adults to help them, adults who are within reach, but don't know how to speak up. But they need to have that. They need to help take care of themselves by doing what? Talking about feelings, breaking that rule, making healthy choices and celebrating me, which is part about talking about breaking the rule. And so when you think about a child and you think about those rules, don't talk, that means they believe if they tell anybody, even their best friend, what's going on at home, that it will be their fault and the family will be in trouble. So they believe it will be their fault and they fight that. And then they try to be safe, and they do that by being quiet. They don't talk. And they learn very early on not to express their feelings. If they're excited about something that's successful, then they will be laughed at or demeaned. Oh, you think you're so smart. And if they talk about their feelings about things that they're afraid about, they will be punished. And they learn that very early in life. So they are masters at keeping secrets, even secrets from very perceptive adults. So what do we do at NACOA, and what do we want you to do? We want you to realize that children need to know those rules, and we need to do things that help to break them. And we need to have them understand that they can take charge of their life and their surroundings to a certain extent, that they can get better. And they learn something else. They learn that they deserve to heal, that they deserve to recover. And now I go back then to Dr. Volkoff when she said children or people recover in relationships. What children do in programs like Jerry's and in support groups in schools and in community organizations, what they do is that they learn, they sit with other children like them, and they develop relationships with those children, and they hear their own story when the other children are telling theirs, and they find out that it isn't their fault. They find out, the children, their peers tell them it's not their fault. Their peers tell them that they can have a good life anyway. Their peers tell them that they are okay. And so the lessons in those groups are what usually is enough for most children especially if they can continue to attend them. So many schools that have these, that we would call them concerned persons groups in schools, those schools have them open-ended. Children can keep on coming. They don't, it's not a set period of time, so that they continually to get reinforcement. And as they recover, guess what they do? They help other children like them to recover as they have a good time together with wonderful counselors like Jerry Moe. So what I hope you're going to come away with today is understanding that every time you help a person who sounds prejudiced against addiction and against an addicted person, every time you come into contact with a person who is being stigmatized because of their addiction or their parents or their children's addiction, remember to speak up, to explain that it is a brain disease, and that disease puts their parents in hock to a power greater than themselves, and that that's a grown-up person's job to help their parents, but that they can get better and they deserve to get better. They deserve to have caring parents or caring adults in their lives who are safe enough that they can tell their truth to and get better. So I think at the end of this program today, I ask you to think about what is one piece of awareness that you could do. Could you tell a judge that worked for the district courts and handles drunk drivers? Could you encourage that person to order assessments on the first arrest so that they don't kill somebody on the second arrest and they don't harm those children? Could you, if your neighbor has come home drunk and made a big fuss, could you talk to the other neighbors and say, what can we do to help this family? What about the children? We all can do something, every one of us, and we can do something almost every week somewhere to help people who make decisions about children in the foster care system, wherever, and to develop a sense of empathy for them and a desire to educate them so that more people can work together as a community to protect these children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sis. That was great information for folks. I want to move along in the interest of time, and I know some questions have already started coming in, which is terrific. So I want to allow plenty of time for people to ask questions and make comments. Our next panelist is Daniel Malloy, and I'm going to turn it over to him and let him tell us a little bit about himself and the work that he does with PTACC.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you, Sis, Jerry, everyone on the panel, Ed. My background's a bit different than the others. I come from a career in public safety, law enforcement. I spent almost 30 years in policing. Southwest Ohio is the region that I come from, and served in the role as police chief, police officer. And then I served in a role of director of public safety over police and fire. And the last 4 years of my career, and got to see, the addiction and the response to and the community engagement through both sides of public safety lenses. And the realization is that we knew early in the 2010s that we needed to do something differently, and what something differently looked like, we really didn't know. We just knew we weren't winning the battle in the old arrest our way out of it methodology. And so we built a collaborative response model that engaged different parts of the community. But again, we were still very young in what we did. And so looking at and understanding our responsibility as leaders is kind of where I come from in this conversation, is the realization that as a leader of a community, whether it is a fire chief, a police chief, or a city manager, or a politician, is that you have an opportunity to influence the conversation. You have an opportunity to influence the change, and asking ourselves, you know what, I don't know everything. And I think that was something that we realized very early on. We were not the experts when it came to understanding how we serve populations of families and children. We knew, because we used to talk about it, we know that there's families, they're not running out onto the street and they're not coming up to people in the neighborhood and saying, hey, I just want to let you know that, my husband, my son, my wife, my daughter, whoever that family member is, that they're suffering. They're suffering from addiction. They have a disease. They're not, they're just not doing that. They're closing the blinds, they're shutting their windows. They're not outwardly advertising that. So we knew there was a suffering entity out there, and they knew they were afraid to answer the front door, because as we engaged with our community, those are the conversations that we had. They looked at us and they were afraid at times to answer the door because they thought our news was going to be bad. They expected us to visit. They expected law enforcement, paramedics, that kind of response, because they were waiting for the tragic news. And then we stood at their doorway and said, you know what, we're here for Dan, we're here for Ed, we're here for whoever, we're here to help. And we brought someone that understands what your journey looks like, and we're going to walk with you during that journey. We're going to support you. We're going to help you out. And we want to understand the family needs assistance. So we built an understanding that we needed to talk to the family. We said, we're going to do family engagement. We're going to talk to families. And everybody said, why are you doing that? And we were even it was even as important to us to know that we've got to do that because the issue of stigma is real. And, where we live, the hospital community, part of the community is about 15 miles away from the central part of our community. But we did have, within our local shopping mall, the police department, the fire department had stations in that complex. So we set up our family counseling within the stations. So, if someone saw a family at the mall, well, they're at the mall. There's no stigma attached to that. No one was wondering why family A, B, or C, or, family member was at the station. They just would stop into the station, and next thing you know, we would engage in family counseling and give them the tools. We did teen counseling, talking to those adolescents and realizing that, and our social worker said this was one of the most enjoyable experiences because of the lessons that they learned and the impact that they were making, with each other. Just realizing that it's kind of to follow up what Jerry and Sis said, that safe place that allowed them to be open and real and human without judgment or fear of, somebody saying something or saying something to them. They could just be human and share their fears, their anxieties, and their concerns. And I think that, again, we didn't realize that. We didn't know that. We just realized that there was more to serving in this space and more to what service looked like as a public safety professional, between police and fire looked like. Again, it wasn't us providing it, but we were providing the avenue or the opportunity for that conversation. We were the convening entity that said, hey, come and join the collaborative, because our collaborative is built around responding to the disease of addiction and what's it look like within our community. We started with a collaborative of 3, and we grew to more than 20. Then it did include the schools, included the nurse coordinator from the local school district that had a representative in every school within our 13 school network. And we talked to that. We had a crisis team set up within our school district that expanded not only outside of to all of our public schools, but all our parochial schools as well. Then we talked about issues of importance, and we discussed what was in the best, service to the children. And we had these conversations, but I'll be very honest with you, back in the early 2010, 11, and 12, we weren't talking about the disease of addiction. We were talking about things like swine flu. We were talking about a lot of different things, but the realization is we had the setting for greater discussions because we were already at the table. And people then, we took advantage of that law enforcement role, that fire chief role, that city leader role to say, people were willing to come to sit at the table with us and talk about how we serve, how we better serve. Because again, when we take the oath, and every one of us does it, we commit ourselves to serving our community and then making a difference. And I used to tell the men and women of our agencies, I'll go back to every job interview questionnaire, and I can guarantee that probably 9 out of 10 or 9.5 or 9.99 out of 100 of you told us in some way, shape, or form that you wanted to make a difference. You wanted to make an impact. You wanted to positively impact your community, your neighborhood. You wanted to make a difference. Well, this is the opportunity to make a difference. And we just didn't know to the extent of what we were doing. We were doing it with the right reasons. And really, to me, didn't click until I heard Sis speak, at the PTACC conference in 2018. And she said, just remember one thing. When it comes to families and children, keep them in the conversation. That could mean when you're talking about a legislation, a document, you're talking about a service, you're talking about anything, just add on and families and children and see how that resonates within the group. And so to me, I currently serve in the director of operations for Operation to Save Lives and QRT National. Those are the two companies that were formerly led by Police Chief Scott Allen and Mike Botieri from the, Plymouth, Massachusetts area, and myself from Southwest Ohio. We met during COVID last year, and we decided we need to work collaboratively together. And that message, needs to resonate. We need to collaborate. We need to figure out how we can better serve. And service looks a lot different in a lot of different places because of leadership and understanding. Is that we need to make sure we understand that we have a role within this space and helping share that conversation, just like Sis said. Think about it. So, when we talk to communities that we serve, when we work with teams that are out there doing outreach and engagement, we now include a conversation about the families and the children. To the point, the question, the leaving of the day, as a leader, whether you're doing outreach and engagement or you're sitting in that office as a police chief, a fire chief, a city manager, a politician, is, are you including the family and children in your conversation? Have you thought about that? And not just, yeah, I think so. But I mean, we really thinking about the impact that we can have on the families and children in our community, and the power of your voice that you have as a leader, as a community leader? Because I'll be very honest with you, you do have voice. And our takeaway is use that voice to build collaboration and build the people like Jerry and Ed Jacobs and Sis and all the other folks that are experts in this field, and make them available as a resource to the men and women who are walking up to the front doors of the residents in your neighborhood, or answering the calls, responding to the EMS runs, looking at the families when they say, what do we do? Who do we turn to? How do I handle this? Well, we have help. We know people. We can pick up the telephone. We can pick up, we can make that connection almost instantaneously through a phone call or another thing like that. We will get you in connection with people that understand the journey that you're on. So I ask you as leaders to think about, have we included families and children within our conversations, within our efforts, within our teachings? And I think that's important. So appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Smith, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Dan, for that. It's great to hear how you can actually work with children and families in the field, in the front lines. And I think you did a good job of covering what's possible. Great. Our final panelists will be Dr. Ed Jacobs, he'll tell you a little bit about himself, but again, talk about some of the work that he does on the front lines with PTACC. So Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
My name is Ed Jacobs. I work for the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. I'm the Director of Grants and Sponsored Projects. I've been there now for 23 years almost, and prior to that I was a probation officer for 13 and the third busiest juvenile court in Massachusetts, and prior to that I was a school teacher and then ran a detention center for the state for juvenile offenders, male and female, for about 7 years. My work with kids, when I went from probation to the DA's office, so we've been putting out fires at the probation from one case to the next, but where's the big plan? Who's got the big plan? Like, how are we going to address the issues of these kids? Long story short, what I realized was there wasn't a plan. And I thought, well, how do we address this? How do we attack it first? And I read a book called Children Who See Too Much by Betsy McAllister Groves. And that was kind of a game changer for me, probably around 2000. And from that book, I realized that kids have trauma, and a lot of it, and it's far more prevalent than we thought. And I remembered from my detention days seeing kids who would quote unquote go off or needed to be restrained. And I thought, where does that anger, where does that rage, where does this negative energy come from? I didn't learn this in undergraduate work. About 2005, I got a call from a gentleman who was a mentor of mine. He was a school adjustment counselor. And he called me on a Tuesday and he said, Eddie, last Thursday there was an armed home invasion in Brockton, and it was on such and such a street. And I said, well, let me go pull the file, because I was working at the DA's office. So I go down, talk to the state troopers, I get the file. And it tells me that it's a drug house ripoff. One set of drug dealers is ripping off another set of drug dealers. So I called him back and he said, yeah, well, listen, so here's what happened. There were 3 kids in the house and a mother, a 12-year-old son, a 5- and 6-year-old boy and girl. And instead of the drug dealers getting the 3rd floor where the other drug dealers were, they got the 2nd floor. They kicked in the door. and they confronted the mother and they pistol whipped her, and a 12-year-old boy jumped in front of him to save his mom and protect his mom. He got pushed to the ground, had a gun in his mouth. The 5 and 6-year-old are in the back room screaming and yelling. At some point, they realize they're in the wrong house. They leave. The police come and they take the pictures, but the door is still off the hinges. And they take all, the mother and the child, all the kids, to the emergency room. Well, 3:30 in the morning, they come back to the house, and the door is still off the hinges, because who fixes a door at 3:30 in the morning? The mother, God love her, tried to duct tape it, but 15 minutes later, there was another knock on the door, and it was some detectives who wanted her to go outside and look at some clothing that they had found. So she went out there with a 12-year-old son. Now this is 4 in the morning. At 7:30, those 3 kids, the 12-year-old, the 5-year-old, and the 6-year-old, came to school, and they came on time. And when they walked into school, nobody said a word to them. And I began to think that when I was that age, I thought all the adults in my world knew everything that had happened to me, that had gone on. And so I put myself in their position, and I thought, they're thinking nobody says anything. I guess they don't care. I guess this is my new normal. I guess it's no big deal. All of which were, I would say, toxic thoughts for a student to have as a relationship to his school. And by the way, I said, Ed, it couldn't get any worse. He said, oh no, it got worse, because the 12-year-old boy had shared what had happened the night before. He told his classmates that he had a gun put in his mouth. But by the time the rumor got back to the main office, he's got a gun in his locker. So we brought the dogs in, we brought the police in, and now we got to confront this 12-year-old, and they were flabbergasted and realized. And Ed said to me, isn't there a better way? So I said, well, let's take a look at the number of cases that are just in the city of Brockton, in police reports, where kids are present. Brockton has 17,000 school-aged children, 4th largest school system in the state. And what we found was, when we looked at domestic violence, community violence, kids were in the police report 800 incidences over the course of a year. So I started to think about that. 800 incidences, how many kids are in each incident? And then we went back to the police and we said, can you be more defined? They said, we don't always put the kids in the police report, or we don't always put the number because they didn't see anything, or we don't think they should testify, whatever it might be. So I asked them, and we trained them, and I said, can you please do this? Well, the following year we had 1,400 incidents. We began to realize that it was a huge problem. And what were we seeing in kids? What kind of behavior were we seeing in them? We were seeing they were acting out, they become disinterested in school and unconnected, etc. So we really needed to figure out a way to raise the awareness of schools and police, but we also needed a third leg of the stool. And I think we got that in Mass Advocates for Children, which is now out of Harvard Law. They wrote a book that I came across, and I got to meet one of the authors, called Helping Traumatized Children Learn. And in that book, they had laid out how schools can work with kids, whether they know they've had a trauma or they haven't. We trained a lot of teachers. In the meantime, we really felt that we were also missing, how do we share that information? And originally it was in the book, we called it the red envelope. Eddie Jacobs, something happened the night before, they put my name in a red envelope. The teacher the next day would be on his or her desk, and they'd say, oh, there's Ed in the back of the room, he's crying, he's upset, he's agitated, something else. We did a training in West Virginia at the request of the U.S. Attorney and the Department of Education, myself and the DA, and also Joe Restuccia, who wrote the book. And when we did that training, got a phone call from Miss Andrea Da, who's a wonderful person. And she said, we'd like to change that name of that red envelope to Handle with Care. And I thought, it's brilliant, because it speaks to exactly what we want. And so what we were able to try to work with, and we've added other layers, but the idea is that whether the child witnessed domestic violence and overdose, whether their dog got hit by a car, whether someone in their house passed away of natural causes, we had, kind of honed our skills on Felitti and Anders' study on adverse childhood experiences. We were now starting to say, okay, all these things add up. So we need to train police and teachers, police to report it to the school, Handle with Care, and teachers to say, I don't always know who these kids are, but we're gonna get trained, and so that's gonna be the primary prevention. We're gonna look for every kid. We're gonna see secondary prevention is gonna be what are the symptomologies we're seeing, and that tertiary prevention is gonna be identifying that child, Ed Jacobs, on a piece of paper. All it says is Ed Jacobs and my date of birth. That's it. It doesn't say my father overdosed the night before. It doesn't say my mother was beat up. That's all it says, because the idea is that's not important. What's important is that the school give that child a little bit of something extra. And by 2012, it became clear around here that our numbers were looking every bit like Southern Ohio and West Virginia in terms of opioid overdoses. We have a lot of hospitals around here. We had a lot of people who were in denial about the oxycodone opiate epidemic. But by 2015, there was no more denying it. The numbers were just screaming at us. I'll give you an example. In 2013, we had unattended deaths. Our office takes care of, handles those with the state troopers. We had 42. 2014, we had 82. 2015, just 2 years later, 147. And that's the tip of that pyramid. That's that tip of those are the deaths. How many overdoses were there? About 1,800. How many people were using? Far more than that. How many times were kids exposed? So what we saw was that when we looked at that period of death period, 147, 65% of those folks were between the ages of 20 and 39. Prime time, parent time. 70% of the cases that came where the overdose took place was in a home. Who else is in homes? Kids. We assume people go, oh, that's probably in a Burger King parking lot or a Dunkin' Donuts restroom or something. No, it takes place in a home. And kids live there. How do we walk away from that? How do we say, well, geez, we got to throw up our hands? I don't know. We got back together again, brought the band back and said, we got to address this issue. We try to do everything from responding to opioid overdoses from the police. So we have what's called Plymouth County Outreach, which is a lot of places are doing it, where police and the recovery community are working together. So we get referrals there for direct service. We also do a lot of training for police and schools. And now we're working into firefighters, and they've been saying, where you been? It's amazing what we're seeing. They're going, where have you been? So we're doing that. In the meantime, we're also trying to prime the pump on things that we think schools and the communities ought to kind of highlight or champion. Things like a mindfulness program called Calmer Choice, or things like a yoga program for teachers and students called Balance for Kids, or a program that a psychiatrist put together with kids in recovery called Drug Story Theater. We have several groups called To the Moon and Back. They deal with neonatal abstinence syndrome, adopted parents, grandparents, etc. We're just trying to do is create an atmosphere where people are aware of what the problem is, and we just want to stack all our resources on top of each other so we can hit this thing. We didn't want to spread everything out. We wanted to take a hard look at particularly the opioid piece. Now, does that mean that we're going to get kids who have domestic violence? Sure. Does that mean we're going to have kids who have parents who have mental illness? Sure. Does that mean that we're going to have kids who, have other difficulties, their own anxiety, depression? Of course. But having said that, we can drive this train based on these dollars and based on these things we're getting. Let me say this, if I could. We have two things that I learned a long time ago. One is that it's not a program that changes a child. It's a relationship. That's the most important. So we can train. But if we don't get adults to reach out to those kids in their classroom, to take that one extra look at Johnny or Sally, etc., then we're missing our opportunities. The other one is that we want to change the paradigm with teachers and police officers and firefighters and parents and the faith community. We want to stop saying to kids who are acting out, instead of saying, what's wrong with you? We want to start saying, what happened to you? That's our goal. That's our objective. We can start to be a little more empathic to some of these kids and what they've gone through. I think we can change the paradigm and improve their lives and therefore our community.
Ed, do you want to say a few more words? That was a very powerful.
I'd be happy just to share something very quickly, two things. And I think the chief outlined it. relationships are the key, but boy, you really need, you need leadership. You need somebody to step up. And sometimes there's pushback of, well, why are we doing that? We've never done that before, et cetera. So, and I know you all have that in your professions and in your communities, but you have to have a couple of champions. You have to have more than a couple, and you have to keep building them. That's a key piece. And the other thing I tell you, just as an aside to mention about the effectiveness in our schools, we did a study on 3 of the schools that we had done. We'd taken them at random, and we found there was a 70% decrease in suspendable offenses. And that's after 3 years of the training, or 3 years after the training, and also a 43% decrease in office referrals. And I thought it would be the other way around. But quite frankly, when we did a focus group with the teachers, they came back and said, no, when we send them down to the office now, it's a warm handoff. We're not sending them down to get suspended every time. So I would leave it at that. I'd love to take some question and answers afterwards. So, Doctor, I'm going to turn it back over to you, I think.
Okay, thank you, Ed. We have a short video that we'd like to end with. I think the panelists' presentations have really covered a lot of material for you, but we'd like to try and kind of bring it all together. And this is a Sesame Street video. And so I think we can go ahead and run it. And then we're going to go into the question and answers and conversation with you as a participant. So if you want to go ahead and run the Sesame Street video.
Okay, try to catch me, try to catch me. You're good.
Hey, thanks, Chris, for watching me and Elmo while my mom's at her meeting.
Yeah. Oh, of course, it's no problem. I'm always happy to help her out. She's a good friend.
Yeah. What meeting did Carly's mommy have to go to?
Well, buddy, Carly's mom has been having a hard time. So in order to help her get better, she goes to a meeting with her group. They all sit in a circle.
Oh, Elmo likes singing circle time in school. Oh, does Carly's mommy sing songs in a circle?
No, they talk about grown-up problems. She goes every day so that she stays healthy. You see, well, my mom needs help learning to take better care of herself, so she talks to people with the same problem.
You see, buddy, everybody there is having the same kind of hard time. So they talk with each other about it.
Oh, well, when Elmo talks about a problem that Elmo's having, it helps Elmo feel better.
Well, me too. And so I go to a special kids-only meeting. Our parents all have the same problem. We sit in a circle, and at the end, we hold hands and we sing.
Well, Elmo really likes holding hands with his friends.
You know, holding the hand of a friend can really help you feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sure can. Hand in hand.
Come here, guys.
Jerry, did you want to say a few words about the video?
Sure. Well, special thanks to NACOA, the National Association for Children of Addiction, who worked on this project to make it happen, and especially to Sis as well. So I think what we've heard this morning is that everyone can make a difference in the life of one child and one family. Help them to understand it's not their fault, they are not alone, and there are safe people and safe places that can help. Now, having children and families be a part of diversion and deflection activities is critical. Let's not leave out the children and families. And to keep in mind that PTACC is the leader that can help you make that happen. Iris, back to you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you so much, Jerry. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their expertise and experience with us today. There were some powerful stories that we heard, certainly illustrating the depth of need there is for those children and families out there, but also some very positive actions that we can take as individuals and as organizations to help to fill the void in terms of services for those children and families. So now I want to open it up to panelists. You're free to ask questions to participants. I mean, you're free to ask questions of any of the panelists, or if you just want to post a general question, we'll try and direct it to the appropriate panelists to respond. Each of the panelists, I think, has given you some questions to really think about. So we'd like to hear not just your questions, but also some of the successes that you've experienced in working with law enforcement and children and families involved with the criminal justice system. And how do you include the children and families in the work that you do? And what are some of the challenges that you've experienced? And then take a moment, I guess, to think about, what are some of the steps that each community can take to move from practice to policy so that the very positive outcomes that we've heard about can become part of policy and available to a lot more communities. We have one question that's already come up, and the question I think should go to Sis. And the question is, do you find benefits in actually identifying the kids and offering a group session for this population during school hours so they can know they are not alone in their suffering and offer extra resources and tools?
Yes, I think it's tremendously beneficial for several reasons to run educational support groups in school on school time. Initially, teachers would balk at that, saying, well, the kid's hardly passing. How do you want to let them out? But the bottom line is, when children are struggling with all the things that we've been hearing about, they cannot learn well. They cannot function in the classroom, and they are very disruptive at times. And so if they leave the class for an hour every week and go to an educational support group for, let's say, for concerned persons, they learn what Jerry was talking about, all the lessons that kids need to learn. They learn to break the rules. They learn the 7 C's, and they change their brains in the process of that learning. And then that changes their behavior. So the classroom behavior is improved when these children start going to the sessions, and their academics improve after they've been going to the sessions for a while. So educationally, it's a positive all the way around. That's one of the reasons. But, school is where the children are. And school is where there are adults who care about children because they work in education. And so if that's where the children are, and that's where the most likely caring adults are available, that's the place where we want to do this. This is really part of the student assistance concept, where we have educational groups in schools for a number of reasons, including alternative to suspension, that a lot of those young people Ed was talking about would do well in one of the alternative to suspension groups. They would earn the space, and then they would get the help that they need. So I think that doing it in the school benefits education, and it benefits families and children, and that's what I would recommend. Jerry?
Thank you, Sis. I hope that answered your question. I believe that question came from Samantha Parker. Another question that has come in is regarding law enforcement officer buy-in when training law enforcement to recognize how addiction affects the lives of children. And that might be a good question for Dan.
Great question, because that was probably, I go back to a road trip coming back from a meeting in Dayton, Ohio, that was all law enforcement, and asking the 2 people that were in the vehicle with me, so what do you think? I mean, do you feel like, it was probably back in 2013, and they looked at me and said, the first thing we have to do is change the culture. We have to educate ourselves on the disease of addiction, which we didn't call it the disease of addiction back then. It's a very powerful piece. We have to educate ourselves. And again, it falls back to that responsibility of leadership to understand we have to continue to learn. We never know all the answers. We have to continue to drive and be open to what we're facing, and realize we're not the smartest person in the room, and there are resources in our community that can help us better understand. And that's kind of where the mountain that I decided to climb was I have to get into these meetings and further educate myself, because I need to be able to sit in the briefings. I need to be able to walk in the room and talk to firefighters and talk to police officers and help them understand, the lens that I'm seeing through, and help them grow and realize that service can look differently in a lot of different forms. We've been responding to tragedies for many years, and what are we going to do differently now, and how are we going to do that, and why is this so important? So the realization that education and getting officer buy-in, you're always going to have, and I go by the 20-60-20 rule. 20% of your organization will support you no matter what. 20% will never support you. It's the 60% in the middle that can vacillate depending on the day, the incident, the circumstance. So that's the group that I really need to focus on, so they understand the why. And that's the question that why are we doing this? Why is this important? Why do we care? That's the question that we need to answer, because the realization was, by talking to the men and women who were on the front lines, this was a struggle for them, because this was the one question that we did not have an answer to. And police and fire are very, very used to being called in that 911 scenario and having answers, whether it be a medical emergency or a criminal situation or a domestic or whatever that case may be. We are supposed to have the answer, and in most cases, we do. But when we were looking at families suffering from the disease of addiction, and they asked us, what do we do now? The feedback from our men and women was really powerful. It's like, this is the one question we don't know the answer to. So psychologically, it was bothering them. Just personally, it was bothering a lot of them. We had to educate, and giving them the tools to be able to respond to families and being an answer. Again, we weren't making them professionals in the world of addiction and social work and peer recovery. We were just giving them a tool to be helpful and making them feel like they were a part of the solution, versus just saying, I don't know, wish you the best, and then getting in our cruisers or our fire trucks and driving away. So that educational piece, and buy-in doesn't happen overnight. I mean, I had a police chief that absolutely did not disagree with me, or did not agree with me, but he supported me, but he did not agree with me. And I used to tell him, I understand where you're at, because I was exactly where you were. But I understood my responsibility as a leader was to think differently, challenge myself, and learn. And then he came into my office in 2017 and said, I know I was difficult, but I understand now. And we have a million of those stories from firefighters and police officers and paramedics along the way, that they each got it in their own place and time, but they understood what we were trying to do, and they gave us the chance. And again, I think a lot of that is how much we trust our leaders in an organization. Anyway, you can't just get up one day and say, we're going to do something and expect everyone to follow. We have to carry ourselves and lead appropriately, since from the day we get hired. So, we have, I call it that emotional bank account, that we can make a serious withdrawal was. And for me, it was a serious withdrawal at the beginning to get people to buy in. But that buy-in is developed over time. And they say culture change doesn't happen overnight, but we have to start somewhere. And, education and understanding and answering those why questions are really powerful to that.
Very good. I think one of the things that you said really impressed me. I've done a lot of work in prevention and working with community coalitions to develop prevention strategies that fit their community. And I think one of the things that's important for people to understand is that the burden of change doesn't rest with any one person or any one organization. And as you said, you're not trained to be a psychologist or a counselor or a social worker. So the important thing is to reach out to those organizations and individuals who have those kinds of resources to share. And I heard that also in Ed's presentation, in terms of reaching out to these organizations, getting their buy-in and educating them so that they can come to the table and really build capacity within the entire community to serve these children better.
Iris, could I just make a point with that as well?
Sure.
So for me, I'm a counselor, I'm a clinician. We could not do our program without the support of law enforcement and firefighters and other first responders, because we're always looking for referrals. And think about all the situations that our law enforcement and firefighters and paramedics are put into.
And it's been my experience when we create that partnership. Ed talked about developing those relationships. As we do that and empower them, let's do this together. You see things that I'm not seeing because I'm not in your shoes when you're out there doing all of these things. But what I can do is I can give you some language to use with little kids when you're rolling up to a scene where there's a lot of crisis, just how a few words can help with the trauma. And here's this program that you could send boys and girls to. So without that real close connection with law enforcement, with judges, with drug courts, if we're not working together, then we're not getting boys and girls and families the help they need. That's the partnership.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Another question has come in. Do you have any tips for hiccups to avoid for bringing Head Start and other early childhood providers in to participate in an existing Handle with Care program? And I don't know, that might be a question for Ed or Sis. And Ed, do you want to make a comment there?
Yeah, I think every community, every agency, even within agencies within communities, are going to handle with care a little bit differently. Some say, wow, we're into this. We're going to make sure that we don't miss anything. And then it's also the mechanism. Is it going to be the SRO who goes to the school resource officer who goes to the department in the morning to the station and at 7 a.m. and looks at the logs from the night before? Is it going to be that some chiefs are, say, more bought in than others or have more administrative capabilities, and they're going to put a red tag on it so that when the school resource officer goes through, he's going to find those? And then it's about connecting with the relationships. I don't think I would want to just do Handle with Care with a school or a daycare. We've done those after school programs, YMCA's, Boys and Girls Club, that didn't get the training about what ACEs is, what trauma is and isn't, and some ways that they can, it's not enough to say, hey, there's a problem out there. We have to offer some tools in their tool belt. So yeah, I think the communication is going to be, it can happen. There are hiccups once in a while. We've never had anybody say that they didn't want the information. And I'll stick my neck out here. I've been around for 45 years and doing this work. And I'll tell you, I've never seen a child be hurt by information sharing, and we're keeping it to a minimum. But I've seen a whole lot of kids be hurt and suffer needlessly because people didn't take the time to make a connection and share some information. So I don't know I hope that answers your question. I certainly can be available offline to ask you any specifics if you'd like.
Iris?
Sis, did you want to say something?
When Ed was speaking earlier and then again just now, it kept going through my head. A comprehensive student assistance program that it deals with children whose families are breaking apart, children who have addicted parents, children who've gotten in trouble, all have different curriculum and different methodologies, but all of them have to do with, like what Dr. Volkov said, they had to do with groups, kids helping kids. It's part of the relationship thing. And so I would love to actually, I said to myself, I'm going to call Ed because I want to talk to him about some of the things that we could do together. Because really, having the structure in the school and having faculty members tied into it, not people that they have to hire. Student assistance programs usually can use mostly people who are already there, teachers who volunteer an hour of their week every day for co-facilitating, but they get extensive training in doing it first. And it's not therapy, it's education. But as Ed just said, you can't lose learning the right thing.
Yeah, just one quick note I would like to say too about that is sometimes when we started doing this work, back before 2000, 2005, in the early days. We'd say, hey, talk about kids with trauma. I would show people the data because I think it compels them. And they'd say, oh, no, we have, I want you to talk to Sally and Ralph because they went to a training last summer. They're our trauma people. I said, well, how many kids you got in the school? And they'd say, well, 800. So it didn't make sense to me that you had two people. So the idea of what we're trying to do with helping traumatized children learn is that everybody in that school system, teachers, cafeteria workers, custodians, bus drivers, if we can get them, SROs, everybody understands. It's not just two people who, oh, we take the trauma kids and we send them that way. It's not
Absolutely. That's the first rule. I was working with a group of schools yesterday in Washington, and that I said, no, we start with educating all the people that are adults, and we get them committed first.
Thank you, Sis and Ed. Oh, and I see Jerry's got his hand up. Would you like to say something?
Well, the question was about Head Start. And so maybe what wasn't explained well was when you saw that video from Sesame Street spent a couple years, created a whole plethora of resources. So there's a storybook, there's a number of videos. One of the videos, Elmo and his dad, Louie, are talking about what addiction is in words that a 5- and 6-year-old could understand. There's coloring activities. There's some things for the adults and the caregivers. And Ed pointed out too, it's nice to have those materials, but to have some training in terms of how to use them and how to make them effective. So that's just, from the treatment side of things, that has been a game changer. We have not had those kind of new resources created for those younger children in a very, very long period of time.
Good, thank you, Jerry. There is another question on the board. It says, speaking of using words or tools when supporting children in crisis, what are some words that can be used? Phrases that children would more likely find some peace in, probably good for Jerry or Sis to answer.
It's all yours, Jerry.
Well, I'd like to have all of us answer that question because I think we've all used those words in different contexts. I've seen it really effective with first responders when they can to have a teddy bear or something for little kids to hold on to and to hug, and that's helpful. What I like is to explain to the children what is happening right now. I think sometimes kids are more dismayed by what's going to happen now. That's my mom, that's my dad, that's my brother. So in an age appropriate way, talking about that and talking about they need help right now. We want them to be healthy. And here's what we're about to do to try to help them with that. And also to check in. I mean, sometimes some first responders carry a list of feeling faces and ask the child or the younger ones anyway to point whatever feelings they might be having right now and talk about it and letting them know it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be upset, it's okay to be scared, it's okay to be mad. And then so those are just some brief ones.
That's great. Those are some great tools that people can use. I see we're getting close to the end. We have about 5 more minutes or so to go. So what I'd like to do, unless there's some more questions, and I don't see any coming in on the board right now, is if any of our panelists would like to make some final remarks, some thoughts to leave with the audience.
I would like to say something about girls and women in the criminal justice system. We often, when we're talking at PTACC about the children and families, we use the word family generically, but we know that in the criminal justice system, girls and mothers especially really are not treated the same way as others. And that's another whole webinar. So we didn't put it into this one as well, but we should remember that. And that's a question that needs to be asked. What is being done for the mother? And, are they in prison far longer than they should be when they shouldn't have even gone? And when they have their children taken away from them, what are we doing for them? So I just think let's not, I know they're in families, but they need some special attention on this subject.
I'm glad you brought that up, sis. I've done a lot of work with pregnant and parenting drug users. And what happens often in those families is that all the focus goes to the child who may have neonatal abstinence syndrome or going through some other type of drug withdrawal. And often the needs of the mothers are not addressed. They're in some states, they're considered criminals if they're addicted and give birth to a child that's affected by drugs. But we have to remember that those mothers have needs and that they need more than just what law enforcement has to offer. They also need support and treatment to help them recover so that someday they can become better parents. So I'm glad that you did bring that up. Any other final comments before we close out today?
Thank you for moderating. You did a great job.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just one item for me, and I think this is something we learned along the way. Don't let great get in the way of good. Realizing that if we work really hard to build the greatest program with the great, we'll wait forever. You know, we learned along the way how to get better, and we were open to that, realizing when we started whatever we were doing, and is that we knew we were going to continue to educate ourselves. We're going to continue to learn. And to me, that was the meeting people along the way, like they're on this panel, helping me understand what we need to do better and how we need to do it. Is, you know, I'm glad we weren't waiting, because we wouldn't have started till 2018 or 2019 in our work, because we just didn't know all the people that we know today. And, you know, so, you know, tackle whatever you want to tackle, bring the people to the table and start working as a community to figure out how to best take care of each other. And, you know, you'll meet more great people along the way to make you go from good to great. So don't let great get in the way of good.
That's a wonderful last thought from today's presentation. I guess the only thing I would add to that is the theme that ran through all of the presentations was the fact that everyone can do something, whether it's an individual who comes in contact with the family, the teacher, the social worker, or just the neighbor. You know, as Jerry was pointing out, everyone can make a difference. So I think that's great. Thank you, Dan. All right, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of our participants, and I don't know if you have questions that come up for you afterwards. I guess we can get a link or an email address that they can write to contact the panelists with any lingering questions or advice. So we'll make sure that you get that. But thank everybody. Thank you everyone for being a part of this. I think it's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor.